Greetings, I'm your host Evgeniy Ponasenkov, and today begins my new TV program titled The Truth of the War of 1812. Quite recently, and very regrettably, sneering has become our first reaction to words like sensation or truth, especially when they reference certain historical events. Perhaps this is because for the last 15 or even 20 years during which we've been allowed to view our own history, and indeed the history of the entire world with greater freedom, those years have been rife with potboiler research, shallow broadcasts and publications. Yet, we have no right to disavow that which is truly significant, the truth in its most essential and general sense, the truth of our lives, of our history. Because, as a matter of fact, nothing truly disappears into nothingness. It remains alongside us, the events, phenomena, energy. Like genetics, they are inherited and perpetuated, affecting us in profound, unending ways every single day of our existence. This year, we celebrate a grand anniversary, a jubilee of the War of 1812. It is crucial to comprehend how it came to pass that two powers separated by vast territories, connected by neither rival borders nor shared interests or rather contrarieties, managed to meet in a relentless contest. For what motives was Russia fighting? Why was the blood of hundreds of thousands of our countrymen spilled? It's not without reason that people smirk sarcastically when they hear the words truth or historical sensation. After all, we're talking about 2 centuries of forgery, 2 centuries during which the ideological machine crafted a myth, a monstrous myth about the War of 1812. To decide what's true and what's false, that is our objective. That is the conundrum we must solve with the help of 2 instruments: documents which reveal facts and logic. Honestly, that's all that's required for science to work. I have one single goal: to elucidate all of you, and I'm sure you folks are signally curious, which is wonderful, to compliment you with what historical scientists know. I aim to share what they discussed during conferences where the published materials are printed in ridiculously small quantities, just 100, 200 or 300 copies, like some exclusive club where participants only read each other's work. It's a pity, but these are the conditions we're playing in. Luckily enough, there is radio and television, allowing us to work on a much broader spectrum. But on the other hand, it may create some incompleteness and a certain insularity of measures. Nevertheless, we will most certainly recount the most important facts and discoveries. And besides, during this series, you'll come to know how it happened that these 2 powers, France and Russia, became adversaries on the battlefield. Who bears the guilt for stirring this conflict? Why more than 20,000 Russian soldiers wounded during the Battle of Borodino were abandoned in Moscow and burned alive? And why the Russians ultimately failed at Borodino? You will also learn of many manifestations of the incredible, genuine and true heroism of our countrymen. Now, let's set all affairs in the right order. You do understand what the individual means in history and their historical influence. This is something one cannot overestimate, especially when it pertains to the era of monarchy, when the fate of entire nations bowed to the will of specific individuals. So, when we study the history of the War of 1812, we must first focus on the characters and fortunes of, let's say, the two main celebrities of the time, Napoleon Bonaparte and Alexander I. Well, let's begin with the eldest, the French warlord and emperor. I assume there is no other figure in world history who is more popular and universally recognized. And by popular, I mean in the widest sense imaginable. Indeed, he's affected tourism, even cuisine, certain clothing motifs and fashion. The cast iron statuette that Pushkin wrote about, representing Napoleon, adorned the homes of all Russian intelligentsia, starting with the creative class, the great writers and poets of the Golden Age. This reverence persisted even into the Soviet epoch, when the intelligentsia reveled in the works of Evgeniy Viktorovich Tarly and Alfred Zakharovich Manfred. Before them came the entire Silver Age, with figures like Tsvetaeva and Akhmatova, both of whom simply adored Napoleon. Dmitry Sergeyevich Merechkovsky's famous book, Napoleon Ecce Homo, is, in my opinion, one of the most profound explorations of his personality. Scientifically speaking, it is an exceptionally deep work, brimming with literary references and source material. Merechkovsky identified Napoleon as a man from Atlantis, emphasizing his talents, colossal willpower, and personal magnitude. Why this overwhelming adoration? First, because he is a romantic figure, destiny itself, the kind you can't fabricate on purpose. I always think, just imagine this is a film script. Some screenwriter marches into a producer's office clutching a script about a man and his strange, extraordinary fate. No producer would greenlight it. Nobody would agree to bring such a story to life because, sure, it's fiction, but what kind of fiction? It's too fabulous to believe. The story spans islands. A boy born on Corsica somehow claws his way up to become a young general, then a consul, then he reinvents France itself and rises to emperor. Egypt, Italy, Berlin, Vienna, Moscow, Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna, the 100 Days, his triumphant return to France, his great deeds, the magnificent consulship, the coronation. This all belongs to one man. It already feels sensationally unreal, does it? And in the end, another island, Saint Helena. It's a metaphor. The man Napoleon is an island in himself, separate from the rest, alone in the vast ocean of life and its affairs. The three defining islands of his life are Corsica, Elba, and Saint Helena. By the way, if you didn't know, back in school in his geography notebook, after long stretches of blank pages, there is one tiny inscription, Saint Helena, small island. And then nothing but blankness again. What does that mean? Did he somehow sense what lay ahead, what awaited him? And I say, Napoleon's fate is so unthinkable that it's difficult to believe. What is the life of Napoleon? What does this spectacle mean, this grand theater of his, this supreme stagecraft? The answer lies beyond only to be comprehended by us. Because, as it appears, his fate was of the great lot, the mission from above. Consider this particular fact. As many of you know, throughout the countless battles where Napoleon fought, his adjutants were killed, which is entirely logical, given the relentless hail of bullets and shrapnel. And yet, even as horses were ripped apart beneath his very saddle, Napoleon himself remained unscathed. Therefore, what was the purpose? What was his mission? Why did destiny or doom preserve him till the end, from the first island to the last? What was the historical or perhaps metaphysical quest he was chosen to complete? I suppose we will never know the answer, but therein lies the beauty of it, the allure of the riddle, the mystery, how it resists resolution. Like the greatest works of the art, the poetry of Pushkin, Goethe's masterpieces, Shakespeare's sonnets, or the sublime paintings of Leonardo, these are all mystery. And so, among all the incredible aspects of his life, there is still something tangible for us to analyze: the historical, the social, and the materialistic. These elements are within our reach, dissected and understood through the lens of historical scholarship, by means of documents and logic. This is how we come to recognize just how extraordinarily gifted this man was, and in so many different arenas: a warlord, a statesman, an administrator, a politician, and a diplomat. And each of these roles is vastly different from the others. You can be a marvelous politician but abysmal in administration, or vice versa. A gifted statesman, the architect of a realm, yet a weak politician, blind to the critical juncture of events, when you must sense the gravity and navigate through. One might be an unbeatable war master, the god of war, yet completely assailable in civil life and civic society. You could be a man of immense talent, but somewhat autistic, living your gifts as a thing in itself. Of course, Napoleon indeed was what one philosopher called a thing in itself, yet he could cooperate marvelously with individuals of distinct character, gifted personalities, and even with crowds. He understood perfectly what the crowd wants, and he had an extraordinary grasp of human nature. One of his many gifts was his foresight in identifying the most talented individuals across various fields. He was environed by true professionals because he had no fear of surrounding himself with brilliance, and that is what sets a genius apart from a nobody. Nobodies are always afraid to stand near the truly gifted, as such comparisons do them no favors. Napoleon had no such fear. That is why all 26 of his marshals and generals were extraordinarily capable men. The same can be said of his ministers, his consuls, and the others. True, Napoleon's mindset was of a calculating, logical nature. He discovered a geometrical theorem, he was an exceptional artilleryman and a skilled cartographer. Beyond that, he was a brilliant lawmaker. I'm referring, of course, to the Napoleonic Code, the civil code. Moreover, when we read his letters to Josephine, they stand out as an indisputable body of literature, passionate, subtle, tender, and teeming with poetic metaphors. And in his memoirs, dictated in St. Helena, we find yet another significant contribution to literature. His writings are a testament to his extraordinary memory, as he recalled not only the details of his regiments and corps, but even the battalions, individual soldiers, dates, and the geographical details of each battlefield he commanded. He had a remarkable sense of style. One can be a good writer, even a philosopher, like Tolstoy, yet still lack style. Napoleon, in that regard, stood apart. His works are effortless to read, free of burdensome wordiness or padded rhetoric. He mastered many disciplines, and it's not without reason that people refer to him as Dame Fortune's darling. But that saying is only half true. He was, above all, an extraordinarily hard-working man with colossal willpower. He was a machine, a computer, ruthlessly efficient in executing his projects. And yes, when we scrutinize his achievements, one thing becomes obvious. To accomplish so much, this man must have been working 20 to 21 hours a day. No one can endure such a workload, and it took a toll on his health. Indeed, this was not merely a matter of physiology, but of sheer will, cataclysmic volition. I believe one of the most interesting studies on Napoleon's life came, curiously enough, from the pen of an Englishman, Vincent Cronin, who revealed certain aspects of the emperor's life. Cronin dedicated an entire chapter to Napoleon's domestic activities, detailing his relentless work schedule, how he exhausted himself, and, naturally, his ministers, whom he might summon at 4 a.m. for a debriefing that could stretch until 6 a.m. Napoleon knew by heart the details of financial operations and the condition of his Grande Armée. His brain functioned like a genuine computer. Another issue that may intrigue us, Russians, is corruption. Under Napoleon's rule, stealing was a real toil for officials, because he personally examined financial accounts. Yes, it's hard to believe or even imagine, but this is a documented fact. Indeed, piles of papers were reviewed by Napoleon himself, whether through mental arithmetic or on scraps of paper. No math machines or calculators back then. Corruption, it seems, has stumbled against the industrious brainpower of Bonaparte. By the way, speaking of Cronin, here is one myth among many about Napoleon, that of his supposedly short stature. It's a bold-faced lie. At 5'7", he was of rather decent height for late 18th century Western Europe. For comparison, the average height of a Soviet citizen in the 60s was 5'4". Napoleon, in fact, stood a couple of inches taller than many of his soldiers. So, where did that tiny Napoleon myth come from? The answer is quite simple. First, during the Italian campaign, his nickname was the Little Corporal, Le Petit Caporal. But in French, petit doesn't strictly refer to physical size, it also connotes youth. To the seasoned soldiers of 1796, Napoleon, born in 1769, was still a young lad. Second, there were caricatures that portrayed him as a short fellow standing atop a massive globe. Naturally, when a tiny human figure is drawn next to planet Earth, he looks the size of a pinky. And finally, in group portraits, Napoleon often appears smaller than the grenadiers standing beside him, but there is a simple explanation for that. Those particular grenadiers were members of the elite Imperial Guard, and each of them stood at least 6 feet 2 tall. A rare height for the time. Add to that their tall bearskin caps, and, of course, Napoleon looked smaller in comparison. So, this myth was debunked in Vincent Cronin's time, but alas, our local readers, regrettably, remained ignorant. While translating Cronin's magnificent monograph, the interpreter took it upon himself to correct Napoleon's height, assuming the original author had made a mistake. Well, that was nothing short of voluntary distortion. Going back to Napoleon, we must consider that he succeeded in every one of his domestic policy initiatives for France. He was the architect of a new France. Practically all aspects of governmental and political life were reshaped by him. First and foremost, the civil code, the statute book. After the revolution, certain critical matters needed to be firmly established: private property, civil rights, family law, and political freedoms. It must be noted that this code remains legitimate across European countries to this day. It was incorporated into modern constitutions, including the Russian constitution. Thus, the foundation of modern European legal system is rooted in the Napoleonic Code, and the Napoleonic Code is, in essence, a reception of ancient Roman law adapted to the modern era. Beyond that, significant financial and judicial reforms also took place. The Bank of France was established during Napoleon's time, and its statute has remained virtually unchanged for more than 200 years. When Napoleon came to power after the coup of the 18th of Brumaire, France was literally lying in ruins, a colossal national debt, not a mite in the treasury, rampant inflation. Yet, almost immediately, paper money was replaced with solid golden coins, the Bank of France emerged, and the financial situation was swiftly reorganized. He managed to consolidate the fractured nation by appealing to simple, well-recognized interests. Remember, after the revolution, the entire state was politically splintered. Revolutionists, Jacobins, Republicans, monarchists, royalists and emigrants, those who were forced to flee the country. And yet, Napoleon succeeded in uniting the nation. This was the era of his brilliant consulship. But one significant issue remained at hand, and it was a real tragedy, one worthy of Shakespeare himself. From the revolution, Napoleon inherited not only certain domestic challenges, but also the legacy of European expansion. The fact is, as you know, after the French Revolution of 1789, monarchist Europe raised its banners against rebellious France. England, in particular, was among the leading instigators. Though not a feudal state, England posed an even greater danger to France. It led the echelon of early capitalism. These two nations were implacable rivals in economics and trade development. The British fleet was indeed stronger than the French, but not fundamentally so. England had to seize the new situation on the continent, exploiting the hostile stance of the monarchist states toward revolutionary France. And indeed, England did so masterfully. Britain fought by proxy, using other nations' men as cannon fodder. According to the documents of the anti-French coalitions, Britain paid £100,000 for every 250,000 continental troops deployed, including Russian forces. Russia, obviously, was in dire need of money, so was the imperial family. Little did people know that the loan taken out by Catherine the Great from the small country of the Netherlands was paid off only in 1898. That fact is a surefire red flag, signifying just how dreadful the financial situation truly was. And Napoleon inherited all the momentum of the anti-French coalitions, forces against which he fought brilliantly as a general, then as consul, and finally as emperor. Of course, he was never the aggressor, and under no circumstances could he have been one, even in theory. It was utterly ridiculous, back in my student days at Moscow State, to read in one of our textbooks that these coalitions were referred to as anti-Napoleonic, as if it all began in 1793. Let me remind you, in 1793, Napoleon was a penniless officer struggling to afford a single meal a day. But now, in the twisted minds of certain so-called professional scientists, Napoleon is still associated with aggression. This is how thoroughly the ideological machine has warped facts and logic over the past 200 years. That's why such phrases could appear in academic materials. So, Napoleon achieved many significant reforms in domestic policy. But what else made him so successful? Naturally, his military talents, the way he crushed his enemies on the battlefield. Without those abilities, Napoleon would have failed to demonstrate his governmental and political genius. No renewed France would have emerged. Instead, we would have faced the restoration of the old Bourbon order, not in 1814, but 15 years earlier. France would never have risen as the flagship of modern Europe. And that is what gives Napoleon his immense historical significance. On one hand, he introduced a new type of European state, efficient, progressive, and modern. On the other hand, he somehow managed to hold back the expansion of those British-sponsored European coalitions, to stave off the occupation of France for as long as possible. By the time the Allies entered Paris in 1814, it was already too late. Over those 15 years, France had been fundamentally reshaped into an entirely different country. The monarchy and feudal regime could no longer be reinstated. And this is what makes Napoleon a monumental historical figure. Pushkin understood it perfectly when he wrote, "His hand, mid strife and battle, founded eternal liberty for man." This, of course, refers to the civil code and all those reforms and advancements Napoleon achieved. And he influenced other countries in Europe as well, not deliberately though. Napoleon was dragged into Europe by the permanent aggression of the coalitions. Neither France nor Napoleon initiated any of these wars. But when you win a battle, well, the subsequent peace treaties will inevitably favor the victor. It simply cannot be otherwise. And by defeating his enemies, Napoleon naturally brought about certain reforms in their territories. In some countries, feudal homages were abrogated. In Spain, for example, a handful of medieval customs were abolished, such as the taxes imposed between neighboring villages, which, of course, had been stifling the economy. And let's not overlook this. That vile institution of the Inquisition was abolished as well. You must understand, it is the brilliant and gifted who always push history forward, while the masses always try to hold it back and delay progress. The consciousness of the collective, the rabble, can never match that of the genius. If Pushkin was able to write his great verses, it doesn't mean that the rabble could suddenly comprehend what they were about, nor could they ever speak with the same sophisticated parlance Pushkin did. When considering Napoleon's personal qualities, we cannot overlook what Goethe called him, the soul of the world, no less. And I must also mention that they knew each other personally, spending several days together in conversation during Napoleon's stay in Erfurt for his meeting with Alexander. Interestingly enough, during this stay, he almost completely ignored the Russian emperor, thus delivering a hard blow to Alexander's vainglory. I mean Goethe's disregard toward Alexander. For many years afterward, Goethe would recount to his kith and kin just how phenomenally striking Napoleon had appeared to him. He spoke of Napoleon as the greatest man who ever lived. And I believe that these appraisals, given by figures such as Pushkin, Goethe and Merezhkovsky, are more explicit and insightful than even the deepest and most detailed scientific studies. At the same time, let's say a few words about Alexander. Here is what Pushkin wrote about Alexander I: a monarch weak, and also cunning. Gogol personified Alexander in the character of Manilov, a sort of nice fellow, very affable, who dreams up many pleasant good doings, but never brings any of them to life. Why? Well, he simply does nothing. He lacks talent, drive, and any particular purpose. When comparing these two characters, we must also consider one crucial factor: fortune. Napoleon was fortunate enough to complete what he had planned, whether on the battlefield or in reforming France and Europe. Alexander, as we'll observe, failed passim in every endeavor. But history always gambles with human fate. And here we see a striking example of it, where the exterior image diverges from the inner reality. Yes, Alexander entered Paris, but to what end? From his youth, he dreamed of taking Napoleon's place, of embodying what Napoleon represented to Europeans, the French, European intellectuals, and above all, the Russian intelligentsia, formed by people from various ranks, including the elites and military officers. But he failed. He demonstrated no military ability, nor did he achieve anything noteworthy in domestic policy. As we know, his reign ultimately devolved into the Arakcheyev regime. Realizing the complete failure of his life, Alexander plunged into mysticism, obscurity, and extreme religiosity. In the end, he spent hours standing in front of icons, praying for forgiveness. And indeed, he had many sins to atone for, which we'll discuss later. He even developed calluses on his knees. Aside from politics, economics, and other material aspects, there is always the psychology of the individual at play. Envy, egoism, talent or the lack thereof, temper or torpor, and so on. Alexander's psyche was severely mutilated by his highly challenging and, I dare say, wicked education. He grew up, as you know, caught between the hammer and the anvil. His almighty grandmother, Catherine the Great, and her extravagant, yet undeniably gifted son, Paul I. Catherine despised Paul. She intended to push Alexander onto the throne, bypassing her own son. And everyone in the nobility knew it. Paul knew it too, which made father and son veritable rivals. And so, Alexander, still a child, was forced to maneuver between these two personas, smiling at both and, naturally, pretending. Yes, this maimed his psyche, and at the same time he learned the art of duplicity. The Talma of the North, that's what they called him, Talma being the great French actor of Napoleon's era. A true master of counterfeit and deceit. He was indeed an extraordinary hypocrite in diplomacy, deceiving people while crafting treaties and conducting negotiations negotiations. Yet, on the other hand, once the mischief was managed, he had no idea how to use the harvest reaped through deception. We'll return to this topic later. Right, now we see these two main players on the European stage. Russia, generally speaking, wasn't integrated into European politics, economy, trade, or financial life, but thanks to Alexander, driven by vanity and jealousy, which we'll discuss later, Russia became entangled in this long, grueling struggle against France and Napoleon. Here, we must also mention Frédéric de la Harpe, the tutor of young Alexander I. It's a real shame that none of my countrymen have paid any serious attention to the correspondence, a very interesting correspondence, between young Alexander and his mentor. Frédéric de la Harpe, this sneering and self-satisfied Swiss, was undoubtedly a man of distinguished intelligence. However, as is often the case, he completely missed the point regarding the specific nature of the country the future emperor was destined to rule. Under his tutelage, Alexander's mind was shaped primarily by images of ancient heroes and antique history. From his childhood, Alexander was consumed by a grand obsession to become a classical hero. But who had already emerged as a true classical hero? Who, after centuries of slumber, had brought the world of antiquity back to life? Napoleon, of course. He was the centerpiece of every conversation. Busts of the young General Bonaparte, Bonaparte the consul, still without the iconic tricorn, adorned the rooms of Russian officers, young people, the aristocrats at the turn of the century. And naturally, Alexander's soul was tormented by the realization he would never become the hero he had dreamed of being since infancy. And these letters, their fascinating conversations, which I was the first in Russia to study, prove that Alexander, in reality, could care less about the country he was to inherit. He was fixated solely on Europe, and above all, France. His ambition was to become a hero to those nations, enlightened as he believed them to be, and indeed to the French. Ancient heroes were the only subject that consumed both Alexander and his tutor. Undoubtedly, this obsession laid the foundation for the policy, foreign policy, Alexander would later bring to life. And again to Napoleon, since Alexander is the protagonist of our next program. You know, seemingly, it appears that never again will world history witness another man as gifted and versatile, one who would influence Europe as profoundly as he did. The United Europe, when we speak of the European Union with its shared borders, passports, currency, weights and measures, was exactly what Napoleon envisioned. But his vision wasn't driven by aggressive imposition. No, these ideas crystallized later at Saint Helena as a kind of post-factum reflection. By now, we know he wasn't a conqueror in the true sense. He was made into one. He was merely defending himself and France against the anti-French coalitions, and in doing so, naturally marched through the territories of other countries. As a man of reason and logic, Napoleon understood that Europe had to be unified. These nations, shaped by kindred peoples, geography and shared history, from the Roman Empire to the Holy Roman Empire of the medieval era, needed rationalization. But the ability to see so far ahead made him a victim of his own talent. His intellect, his genius, was far beyond his time and epoch. This is a Shakespearean tragedy. To be ahead of the crowd is dangerous, because the rabble never understand the genius, but are always eager to destroy him. After his death, naturally, encyclopedias and tourist agencies would grow rich from his legacy. The rebel and its descendants will continue to make money off his name. But let's not rush. We'll talk about that in our next series of world history. I, Evgeniy Ponasenkov, have been your host today and the author of this program, The Truth of the War of 1812. See you next time.